Excellent. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We've got quite a number of callers, webinar audience members, participants today. Very excited to be bringing our MLA for Nanaimo, Lady Smith. Is that the correct? No, it's not. It's Nanaimo, Nanaimo riding. I should know that. My goodness. Sheila Malcolmson, thank you very much for joining us. And we also have Greg Phillips, reprising his role from last week's webinar in discussing employment law for workers and employers. So Sheila, why don't you start us off? Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thanks, Kim and Greg, and especially to the Chamber for having such strong leadership in the community at really a rotten time in every way, whether it's people worried about health or deeply concerned about our economic future. Everybody's rattled, and to have the strength of organizations like this that are looking ahead and shining a light on some of the good stories and giving people some hope at just an extraordinarily unprecedented time. So I'm going to run through, things are moving so fast, so really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the work that is happening. Yesterday, new announcement that BC is going to take the lead on screening and validating returning travelers, making sure that they have got a self-quarantine plan in place. And if they don't, they will be quarantined by the province. Never thought we'd be even talking about those kind of things, but that was an announcement from the Premier yesterday. Announcement yesterday on support for the organizations supporting victims of domestic violence. Our RCMP in Nanaimo has reported that indeed domestic violence is going up, reported domestic violence going up. Everybody's under pressure, and sometimes staying at home is not the safest place. Victim Link BC is the place to go province-wide if you're looking for a safe place to be. New measures yesterday to support parents of children with special needs who are under particular pressure this time. The number report yesterday was 81 positive tests on Vancouver Island. 11 of those are in hospital. And we've been seeing some hopeful signs that we have been bending the curve and containing the spread of the virus. Very grateful to people that are staying home to do that. And again, this is why we're having this conversation today. We recognize there's a huge economic cost from that protection of our frontline healthcare workers and elders in particular. Also some announcements yesterday on changes to the federal programs, which I'm not going to try to represent. That's for your member of parliament to do, and they're changing every day. But I think two good news pieces, one on Canada Summer grants, which are going to be more generous and more flexible this summer and going into next year, into the school year. And then also the wage subsidy calculation, the federal government has changed again. It looks like they're going to now say business only has to report a 15% loss for the month of March, not a 30%. That affects some of the other programs that we'll talk about. And then a good news piece that the Easter Bunny's been declared an essential service worker and has been trained in the protocols of hand washing and physical distancing through egg distribution. That's some good news, especially for kids that are really having a very hard time staying home and not seeing their friends. Earlier in the week, we had some BC Housing news release about 900 plus hotel rooms that have been secured across the province for dealing with preventing the spread of COVID-19 in vulnerable populations. That's both for need to self-isolate if somebody does get sick, but also social distancing, which can't be achieved in our shelters. Nanaimo was not included in that news release, but those negotiations are well underway. And thank you to the hotels in Nanaimo and the cooperation of the Hospitality Association that's been spreading the word about contract opportunities. Also conversations about using hotels for housing healthcare workers that don't want to return home to their families. All of that work is underway, and we'll get it out in the news as soon as we can. BC Ferries service suspension for Nanaimo is a particular hit. Hundreds and hundreds of workers affected. The unions indicated that they're going to grieve it, so I'm not going to get into the details there, but just just to say that our government is certainly hoping that as have Air Canada and WestJet, some of the other major transportation employers, they've got that access to federal subsidy, and so there is an alternative to laying off workers. In any case, that's all still in play. And then just this morning, the rental support program, the $500 a month, up to $500 a month that BC is offering, that has opened today through BC Housing. You have to qualify for the federal programs, the CERB or EI, in order to show that you need that rent subsidy support. So that's why we waited until the federal program is open. We just got off the phone with a seniors advocate giving us as MLAs across Vancouver Island some more background on the expansion of 211 and some of the United Way programs to support isolated seniors. Just right now, actually still underway, is a press conference with Minister Judy Darcy and the Premier announcing new supports on mental health counseling online, particularly focused on care home workers and frontline responders that don't have access to health benefits through their collective agreements or employment contracts. $5 million going into extend mental health supports, and a lot of volunteers in the mental health professional association that are going to be helping with that, making that money go even further. So that's just today. Kind of any given day, there are that many new things coming out. This is all in the backdrop of the supports that we've been announcing provincially over the last month. $5 billion in income supports altogether. That combines tax relief and direct funding for people and businesses and services. Halting evictions, freezing rent, and the $500 temporary rent supplement so that nobody loses their home. That's been the focus. We haven't yet had the conversations, and I hope that folks online will talk about this today, about commercial rents. That conversation is underway and the decision is ahead of us, but the first tranche has been making sure that nobody loses a home as a result of COVID-19, but the work's not done. Amended the Employment Standards Act so that nobody loses their job because of COVID-19. I think we'll talk more about that, and really glad that Greg's here to give us some extra guidance on that one. We've been matching childcare and space inside conventional classrooms for children of essential frontline workers so that they can continue to go to work. Bolstering senior support in a bunch of different ways, not so much on the income side, but on the overcoming social isolation. And especially, and maybe this is a message that if people pass on to their friends and neighbors, the work that we're funding through United Way and Nanaimo Family Life Association is the major service provider. We want seniors to stay home, period. They don't have to be self-isolating. They don't have to be in physical distress. We just don't want them to go shopping. And so these new services that we're funding match volunteers and community organizations to help people get prescriptions, get food, so that they just don't need to leave their house at all for safety purposes. We are worried about elders. Supporting families who rely on food banks with a $3 million to Food Banks BC. Recipient of that is Loaves and Fishes in Nanaimo, which is doing heroic work across all of Vancouver Island. We're so proud of them. People hit hard in the arts and culture sector. We've just given $3 million in the Arts and Culture Resilience Supplement that's being administered by BC Arts Council. And then the supply hub for businesses that want to donate goods or manufacturers that want to get into the business. Locally, VMAC and Harmac are both in the news nationally because of the retooling of their manufacture process that they're doing. Super proud of them too. And then just more specifically to the small business needs, the measures taken so far, and again, this is our first cut. We want to hear from you what's working and not. Most of this is around the deferral of costs area, waiving electricity use charges for 3 months with BC Hydro, deferring commercial ICBC insurance for up to 90 days, deferring employer health tax payments until September, extending tax filing and payment deadlines for provincial tax, and a couple of other categories, tobacco tax, motor fuel tax. carbon tax, all deferred until the end of September. We've cut the school property tax in half for businesses that own their property, allowing commercial landlords to pass savings on to tenants in triple net leases. Delaying increases the carbon tax, the soft drink tax, and the application of PST to commercial e-commerce transactions. And then in the longer picture, we've established the advisory council. I believe we've established the advisory council, but in any case, set aside the $1.5 billion in economic recovery funding. We're not in a position to be economically recovering. We're still in the thick of this. So that work lies ahead, but the money in the process is in place waiting for that. And then maybe just two measures on the employment side. No worker in BC can be laid off now because of COVID-19. And then this is a permanent change, 3 days of unpaid job protected illness leave for people that can't work because of illness or injury. That's a change that came in just a couple of weeks ago. I was one of the few people in the legislature when those debates happened. And maybe I'll end, Kim, with just saying the cross-party, to have all three parties in the legislature that day to debate $5 billion in new budget funding and some pretty transformational changes to the Employment Standards Act. To have that done respectfully, no cheering, no clapping, no problem, no drama. A bit of drama in Ottawa around the unfolding of a substantial package of support, but I'm really proud of how the BC parties have come together, and we're shoulder to shoulder on this, along with leaders in the community like yourselves. So thanks again for the opportunity, Kim. I look forward to questions.
Yep, I'm going to pivot to Greg now, touching on that, and thank you for answering the Chamber's questions this week. You know, they come up out of the blue, and you've been super responsive to business, to our business community, and getting their questions answered quickly is super important at this time. I'm glad you brought up the mental health issue. We're seeing business owners, operators, entrepreneurs starting to really struggle with the position that they find themselves in, with additional pressures that they never expected to have before, caring for their workers' families, trying to keep people employed when the business revenue stream has been broken up. But the mental health thing that is coming out this morning, I think was really important. And if people would maybe check in on gov.bc.ca, that's gov.bc.ca, to learn the latest. A program called Bounce Back looks extremely interesting and helpful. We're going to be hearing more about that program on our Stay Strong daily information package. And we've kind of done a restructuring and a redesign of that package. So we're going to have one block of information on provincial government initiatives and actions, and one block of information on Canadian federal initiatives and actions. And those will always be found at the bottom of our string of 5 stories. They will be updated daily. It'll look the same every day, and that's so that you know where to find it every day. But as information is changing from Ottawa and from Victoria, those are updated in real time, and people can refer back to those. All of the information that you've provided and that you're providing today is also posted on that Stay Strong. So we have that going out to around 1,500 in our network on a daily basis. Readership is extremely high. So we're happy that it looks like we're providing a resource that people need and people can count on now. I want to flip it over. We closed with some employment standards discussion for you. And so we're going to flip over to Greg now, and Greg can open up, but I'm going to pivot to you, Greg, with a question asking for a friend on this side. And that's if your employer has directed you to go and work in a remote location and you don't feel safe going there, and the province is saying, don't travel to work in destinations that aren't your own, and where you don't have your own localized healthcare facilities, can you turn down that directive from your employer to attend that? If somebody says, we want you to go work off of the Sunshine Coast or the North Island for the next week or two, can you decline that? And without implications on your employability and your future with that company?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kim. So to give you the short version, an employer is permitted to offer a reasonable alternative job for you to do. So we're seeing that already with a lot of employers right now, saying, look, we can't have you on the front lines, as a receptionist anymore because we're closing down, but we've got a bunch of filing that you can do. So it's a reasonable alternative piece of employment in most cases. If the employer or the employee declined a reasonable alternative job within that same employer, they could be terminated. However, the test is reasonableness. So if it's an unreasonable ask of an employee, they can't be terminated for declining. At the end of the day, employers still have an obligation to act reasonably, and anything that's sort of at this stage provably unsafe, they've got obligations not only under the Employment Standards Act to keep their employees safe, but also under WorkSafe BC. So you can't put people in harm's way to for lack of a better word. Now it's all very contextual. It would depend on the nature of the travel, where they're going, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So both employer and employee would probably be well suited to pick up. If not, contact a lawyer, perhaps also reach out to WorkSafe BC or the Employment Standards Branch for some guidance on that, because it can be a minefield. So an employee doesn't want to decline it unless they're pretty sure that what's being asked of them is unreasonable. And the employer, on the other hand, doesn't want to make that ask if it is unreasonable. So like most of what I'm going to talk about, we don't quite know because this is pretty unprecedented. So we're going to have to wait unless government gives us some guidance for the courts or the Employment Standards Branch to give us some certainty on that. And unfortunately, with the courts closed indefinitely right now, that might be months or even years away. So it's a bit of a non-answer, other than to say that the test is always reasonableness. So what I wanted to talk about more generally today was layoffs. It's the number one question that we're getting as lawyers is what do I do? You know, where our business has declined. I'm faced with the prospect of having to lay people off. What do I do? I'm going to start this with a pretty big caveat, and that's that whatever I tell you today may not be true 2 weeks from now. And it may not even be true this afternoon. That's how quickly things are changing. People say this is unprecedented, rapidly evolving. That's true. And unfortunately, because in our line of work, we typically are reliant on tribunals or judges, et cetera, to give us some clarity on that, we may not have that for some time. So I'm going to give you some general information, but if you're thinking about making a significant change to your business, including laying people off, you do want to make sure that you check, that you get up-to-date advice from a lawyer, and do be checking the government websites. Both the provincial government and federal government have been doing a really, really good job of having almost up-to-the-minute information about changes on there. So both levels need to be commended for that, because it makes everyone's job a little bit easier. Now, with respect to layoffs, most people don't know this, but there's no statutory right to unilaterally lay people off under the Employment Standards Act. So when people toss around that idea, hey, I'm just going to lay some people off, me as a lawyer, I have to say, you know what, hold up. If you don't do this right, if you don't do it properly, you may have actually terminated that person's employment. And in BC, when you terminate somebody without cause, it can you have to pay them. You pay them, you either give them notice or more typically pay in lieu of notice based on how long they've been working for you. What a lot of people call severance pay, we call it notice. Now, if you're in a cash crunch, that might be the last thing you want to do. That might be the last thing the employee wants. They may not want to have been terminated, but they are legally terminated. And you might not be able to afford to pay a bunch of people severance pay. Now, even if you do it right, and I'll get into how the legislation works with a temporary layoff, even if you do it right, there's no such thing as an indefinite layoff. So in BC, a temporary layoff can only be up to 13 weeks in any given 20-week period. After that, it turns into a termination without cause, effective the first day of the layoffs, which again means you have to pay them that notice. Now, there's one possible exception to having to pay notice on termination, which I'll get into in a second, but you shouldn't rely on it at this point. So in order for an employer to temporarily lay people off, one of three things need to apply. One, the employment contract needs to allow for it. Some employment contracts do have clauses in there that talk about being laid off, about the recall provisions, etc. Not all of them do, and unfortunately, a lot of people are working without employment contracts altogether. So if it's an express term, that's really easy. You just follow the policies or steps that are set out in the employment contract. It's not going to apply to most people. The second way you can lay people off is if it's an implied term of the contract, because it's an industry where layoffs are just part of the game. So if you're working in a seasonal industry, you might be working on a ski hill where you know you've got 40 weeks worth of work, but they're going to lay you off for 12 when in the height of the summer or whatever. That's really common in certain industries. But the reality is most of us live in this third way of laying people off, where the only way to lay somebody off, an employee off, is if the employee agrees to it. Now, this is where a lot of people run into trouble, and this is the critical point. Your employee must agree to be temporarily laid off. And this is a regular employment situation, not a union. So if you're seeing a downturn and you need to lay people off, like I say, the first place to turn is the employment contract. If the employment agreement is silent on that, or worse, you don't have one at all, then you need their permission. You need the employee to agree to be laid off. Now, to that end, my advice when you're at that situation is not to act unilaterally. Don't just say, hey, you're laid off, don't show up for work tomorrow. The problem with that, the employee may turn around and quite rightfully say, look, that's actually not a layoff. I didn't agree to it. You've actually terminated me. And by the way, you owe me a bunch of money for my termination. Now that's no good for the employee who probably wants to come back to work. It's no good for the employer who has a new unexpected expense. So communicate very clearly with the employee and be as transparent as possible. You want to include, do this in writing or an email or whatever, so you've got sort of a receipt, as it were. Set out the reason why you are wishing to terminate them temporarily. I'd even include information in there about the various government programs, both at the federal and provincial levels. So they have the information right in front of them to say, okay, a layoff isn't the worst thing. I can access some of these benefits, and I'm going to be able to keep food on my table and keep the lights on. Importantly, give them a return date, or at least a date by which you intend to review where things are at. It needs to be a specific day that's less than 13 weeks, because if it's 13 weeks plus 1 day that you want them to come back, you've terminated them, whether you wanted to or not. If you've given them a return date and they agree to it, it's actually pretty good evidence that you didn't intend for them to be terminated and that you actually wanted them to come back. So there's a lot of transparency all around, and that's important, because one day a judge or tribunal members are going to have to be hearing these cases, and you as an employer want to be able to hand something up and say, look, I made it clear all the way along that this was a temporary layoff, and I did indeed offer to have them come back, and they said no. So that helps protect you, as well as helps protect the employee by giving them some certainty about what's going on. So it cuts both ways and protects both parties. You do need to keep an eye on that calendar, as I keep mentioning. At 13 weeks, it's a termination, whether you like it or not. So we're talking about this potentially going on for not weeks anymore, but now months. So what do you do in that situation if you hit the end of the 13 weeks and you don't have a job for them to come back to? You probably, at this stage anyway, have terminated them as soon as that 13 weeks occurs. Now, the maximum exposure for you as an employer, if you have terminated them under the Employment Standards, the minimum amount that you have to pay them is set out in the Employment Standards Act. If you've terminated them, it's up to 8 weeks pay. It's based on years of service. So after 8 years, you have to pay them 8 weeks worth of their pay, and that's the max under the Employment Standards Act. However, if you don't have a contract that limits the employee to that amount, they're entitled to what we call common law damages, which can be a lot more. The Employment Standards Act sets the basement. And at common law, it can be a lot more. If you've got a long tenured employee who might have been working for you for 30 years, and you've inadvertently terminated them because you didn't bring them back within 13 weeks, that 30-year employee might be entitled to as much as 2 years' salary. And if you're not making any money because you don't have any customers coming in, that probably ends your business. So that's why it's really, really critical that you don't inadvertently terminate somebody here. Now, there is an exception to the obligation to pay notice, and I almost hesitate to mention it because traditionally it's been very rarely applied. It's Section 65 of the Employment Standards Act. It says that the notice provisions don't apply to an employee who's employed under an employment contract that's impossible to perform under an unforeseen event or circumstance. Now, to rely on that, the employer has to demonstrate that the job is both impossible to perform and that impossibility is due to an entirely unforeseeable circumstance. Now, the courts and tribunals are going to have to struggle with this down the road. Remember, the courts are closed right now. And in any event, it's a really high bar for employers to meet. And justifiably so. The courts and tribunals are really sensitive to the fact that we don't want to deny an employee who's been terminated their termination pay. Impossible to perform isn't the same thing as really, really hard to perform. Unforeseeable means truly incapable of being foreseen. Generally speaking, traditionally, an unforeseen illness or an unexpected illness has not been sufficient. Unexpected financial burdens, cancellations of orders, loss of personnel. These are all have been found to be not unforeseeable. They're just the usual ups and downs in business. So what's going to happen with COVID at this stage, we don't know. It's too early to tell. Will it make it a job impossible to do or totally unforeseeable? Wait and see, unless, and Sheila, I'll get to this in a moment, we get some guidance from government on this point. Now, generally speaking, in my view, at least at this stage, we need to assume that this exception is not going to apply to most of you, especially in light of the 75% wage subsidy that's offered by the federal government. It would be a tough argument to make that a job was truly impossible to do when there's money sitting there to be used to help pay your employees to do some kind of productive work. So if you've got an employee who is at 12 and a half weeks and wants to come back, or even an employee who says, you know what, I'm not going to be laid off. You have to keep employing me. Take advantage of these wage subsidies, because you might have to get really creative with how you pivot your work, what kind of productive work you can have them do. But as long as you can do that and take advantage of these subsidies, then it's not impossible for them to do their job. And it also means that that it keeps people working, doing productive work. Now, there's some issues with the wage subsidy. For example, if your business only declines 29% year over year and not 30%, you don't qualify. But if that's the case, you're probably giving Paul Manley or your local MP a call to share your story. Another way that you can buy yourself a little bit of time while hopefully some more changes to some of the employment rules come down the pipeline is you can dictate how people use their vacation time. So employers have the right to decide when employees use their vacation time. So you can say, look, you've got 10 vacation days this year, you haven't used them. I'd like you to stay home for those 10 days and use your vacation now. We usually give the employee a fair bit of leeway in terms of how they use their vacation pay, but we don't have to. So that might be enough time, you know, it can be 2 business days or 2 business weeks. That might be enough time for a little bit more certainty to come down the pipeline. Now, I really do encourage you to share any of these issues, sorry Sheila, but to share these issues with your MLA, your MP. It was really truly wonderful to see government come together and make some pretty good changes to the Employment Standards Act. And thanks to Sheila in particular for being part of it. It was a bit of a surreal scene having everybody several chairs apart, but thank you for representing us. That said, I think there's probably a lot of government staff working on this file right now, but there may be some room for more changes as we start to see how this plays out on the ground. For example, other jurisdictions have made some additional changes to their Employment Standards Act or similar legislation that might be helpful here. For example, in Alberta, the length of time you can be laid off for before it becomes a termination was doubled. They went from 60 days to 120 days. So that's about 18 weeks compared to our 13. Now that may not sound like a huge difference, but it's a month and a bit of additional certainty that employers and employees have, and that may be an option for government to consider. Other jurisdictions have also allowed for unilateral layoffs, so not requiring the consent of the person being laid off. That might be a bit heavy-handed, but it seems to work in other jurisdictions and prevent some of these issues that we see where people might say, tough luck, I want to keep going to work. Now, in terms of the exception I talked about, the impossible to perform due to unforeseen circumstances test, I would also encourage the government to consider legislating an answer to that question, one way or the other, which is to say either requiring severance for COVID-related terminations or not, leaving it up to the courts to decide this question about whether or not this is an impossible situation, or the Employment Standards Branch means we're potentially in limbo for months, if not years on this question. So that's an option that I see here on the ground that might give some certainty to employers and employees. I'm going to end this by reinforcing there's a ton of uncertainty in this space right now. If you're feeling like you're walking through a minefield, if what I'm telling you is giving you some anxiety because you've got a whole bunch of staff that you laid off without getting their permission, you're right. It is a minefield. I don't know if it helps or not, but at least you're not alone in feeling this way. Employers across the province and indeed across the country are grappling with this stuff. Hopefully we get some additional certainty sooner rather than later. In any event, I'll end it there, and if anyone has any questions, we can go from there. You're on mute, Kim.
Maybe I'll jump in there just to say, Greg, super helpful, and let's talk about some of those specific remedies. Sure. My understanding is that the courts are open for urgent cases and have been generating some specific rulings. It probably involves, for example, custody arrangements, and are the kids safe in relation to COVID-19, but also honoring the custody agreements, those kind of things. So let's talk about whether we can use those tools. And if you want to give me my marching orders, then let me talk with Minister Baines about moving ahead on some of those questions. Because you're right, this is all a work in progress.
That would be great. We're getting some questions, and so I want to go back to one that came in about 20 minutes ago. a question on the province having a top up for CERB eligible folks, a $1,000 one-time payment. Is that a program? What's the name of the program, and where do people apply? And let me jump in first and just say the Chamber website, nanaimochamber.bc.ca, has a Stay Strong tab at the top. That Stay Strong tab will take you to a long list of government programs and links to those programs. So that might be the best place to look for some answers. And as I said before, those are all being updated in real time. As the government program changes, it'll automatically change on our website as well. So nanaimochamber.bc.ca, click on the Stay Strong tab, and pages long list of programs. But do you want to answer directly maybe that $1,000 one-time payment question, Sheila? And then maybe move on to the school tax reduction or deferral question.
Yeah, great, thank you. So yes, well, this is called the Emergency Benefit for Workers, $1,000 one time at this point. When it was announced, Finance Minister Carol James said part of the intention was with the federal money that had already been announced at that point, our hope was that in every month for the next couple of months, people would get a good chunk of support. And so this is, I think, aimed to come out in July or June. Actually, I shouldn't even guess on that, but I know the timing was hoped to give people a income supplement every month. A little bit further on is an increase to the carbon tax rebate, just because that was a delivery platform that was already there. This has nothing to do with climate change, honestly, but it's a check that we can just double the amount. So you do have to apply for this $1,000 worker emergency benefit. You first have to qualify under the federal CERB or unemployment insurance. So that's why this money provincially isn't available yet. But if you prove your need through those federal programs, then you will qualify for the provincial support. And this link that Kim's got up, which is all oriented around small business, that's a really good navigation tool. It links you directly to the application platform once it opens, or the default is for more general. Well, actually, everything is on this one link, gov.bc.ca/COVID-19. That includes the mental health supports from this morning that were announced. School tax, that's just been cut in half. That's not something you need to apply for. It's same as the tax deferral. You don't need to ask for that. That's just automatically, I mean, if you want to pay your taxes early and you can, then great. But the deadlines have all changed, all until September, and the school tax is cut in half automatically. You don't need to fill out any paperwork for that one.
So that one would appear on our property tax forms, and it will be just automatically done for us before. That will all be figured out and before they print and mail out our municipal property taxes. Is that right? Okay. Question here, theoretical but real. How about employers who are forced to close their businesses completely, such as personal service businesses, some not likely to come back? What is their exposure for severance that they couldn't pay? Or probably a similar question, what about businesses that had to close in such a sudden fashion that they didn't have the resources? They were living from cash register to paycheck. They woke up one day with a provincial health authority order to close their businesses immediately. They have no more resources. They have no more sources of revenue. They've got money that they owe to staff for the current pay period and may have a severance that they have to pay, but they're in deep and simply don't have those resources. Greg, can you address that? Because it's, it's getting into the areas of bankruptcy.
Yep, really great question and timely. So there's actually two questions there. The first one is what is the exposure for these businesses that are really under the under a provincial health order to not operate? That's the hair salons, massage clinics, the personal contact type businesses. I suspect, I don't know, I suspect that the courts or tribunals would say this is more in line with the impossibility test. It's more like your business has just burned to the ground. It's not on fire, but no one can come, no one can go. You're under an order to stay away. That said, we won't know until we start seeing some of these decisions. But my best guess at this stage is that that would be an impossibility type situation. Whether or not it's unforeseeable is a bit of a tougher question, because ups and downs in businesses do happen. So a little bit of wait and see, but I'd be more confident in saying that you do not have to pay severance in that situation than others. Now, the other question about businesses that what if you're not one of these kind of personal service businesses where you just don't have the money? The financial viability or the finances of the employer is not considered. If you're just out of money, or if you're bankrupt, that doesn't absolve you from your obligation to pay severance in these situations. So unfortunately, there may be a pretty significant category of businesses that are caught by this, where they're obligated to pay this severance pay. They can't do it because of their finances, but the courts don't consider that. And worse, even if you're a limited liability corporation, if you're a director of a business, you're actually personally liable for those amounts. So we're going to see some pretty significant spin-off financial effects with this stuff. So I wish I had better news on that, but the amount of money you have in your till doesn't play a role in that question.
Harsh reality, harsh reality. I see a question here. If we've already laid off a worker, can we apply for the government's 75% subsidy? I'm going to suggest that there, if you go to the Chamber website and click on the Canada.ca, you can get all the information on that 75% subsidy. That would be a question more appropriate to Paul Manley as part of the federal program. But Sheila, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I'd say again, both provincial and federal government recognize that everything is in play here. Our immediate focus is on saving lives and getting through this with as few deaths as possible and without overwhelming the healthcare system. So that has had to be the primary objective. There have been so many changes in the weeks following these government programs that I think there's understanding at both levels that circumstances change. And the media announcement this morning that both WestJet and Air Canada, major employers, are rolling back their decision to lay off workers, I think should give anybody at any size of business comfort that is possible. But Kim's right, to go to those federal government links and the provincial government link that Kim's provided also for membership, that is always going to be your best source. And if you're not getting the answers that you need, then yes, go to your MLA, me for Nanaimo, your MP, Paul for Nanaimo Ladysmith. If the programs designed so far are not fitting, we need to hear about it, but you can be sure that businesses and employers across the country are going to be asking the same kind of questions. We know how important it is to get this right, but honestly, the focus has not been on the economic recovery and economic, holding it together. So we do need your advice, and we're really encouraged that the Chamber provincially and nationally is working well with the decision makers to design the best programs that we can going forward.
Maybe some clarification on that answer. I don't want to give out incorrect information or lead anybody astray. That's why I would advise checking either online with us or just going to Canada.ca. It's very easy to navigate the federal website. But if you've already laid off the worker, I imagine that if you laid them off sometime since March 15th, since the program was retroactive to March 15th, you may have some relief in there. I want to move over to a question we got earlier about half an hour ago, which I thought was an excellent question. And in this special time of need, what are the two areas of greatest need in our community? And Greg, I'll go to you first, because as past chair of the Chamber of Commerce, you might have a unique perspective on the two areas of greatest need in our community right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question. I've touched on the one big one, and that's the need for certainty for both employees and employers. There's a lot of anxiety about this stuff right now. You know, people's livelihoods are on the line. I don't have a magic wand that it can't suggest an overnight fix to any of these issues. But getting some certainty about, and it's already starting, but certainty about some programming, about some of these answers to open questions, etc., helping bring some of that anxiety down. We don't know how long this is going to last, but if we know that there's some supports there to get us through, both as employers and employees, that goes a long way to keeping people inside where they belong and not taking risks with their health by going out and being forced into the workforce when they don't need to be. The other area, and this is just from my drives through town, I have very serious concerns about our street entrenched community, and there's already so few services that are readily accessible, and with everything shut down, that's already a hugely vulnerable community, and that's only so much worse with services shut down. Even things like bottle returns being shut down, which is an important source of income for some of the street entrenched folks. Those things are all gone. So we're probably going to get through, but I'm deeply concerned about some of that population.
I would concur with you on that, and I know that the Chamber is a member of both the Homeless Coalition and the Mayor and Council's Task Force on Health and Housing, and I know that we've been working overtime on those files, trying to get fixes in place as quickly as possible, and there are myriad challenges there, as I'm sure you also understand, Sheila, and you're tuned into this channel. I know that.
Yeah, well said by both of you. Our most important action is to protect the vulnerable, to prevent this virus from getting into care homes. Vancouver Island's population is older than the rest of the province. Touch wood, we don't have any outbreaks, but we've seen from the almost every death on the Lower Mainland has been in a care home. And so we've already made changes provincially to not have care home workers moving multiple jobs from one care home facility to another. That's a huge step, which is going to bring some protection, but that's still the thing that's got me on edge. I share your concerns deeply about those living without homes. We ask people to beat COVID-19, wash your hands and stay home. People that don't have a home, and with restaurants closed, they have less ability than they ever did to keep clean hands. It's a huge challenge. So Kim's right, we are working overtime on this. Emergency Management BC is the non-partisan, non-political leader of the action, working with all the police, fire, city, BC Housing, Island Health, and all the frontline service providers. We've got more money to spend on looking after homeless and vulnerable populations than we've had before. And so you're going to see some changes in the coming week, I believe. But you're right, you know, that first piece is to protect the workers that are working with those vulnerable people, and to bring support as fast as we can to those entrenched populations. It's a huge vulnerability. And I would say maybe so that's kind of like one bucket of action is on the health front, and the other is to give people some hope so we can get through this crisis with as much economy intact, as much mental health intact, and as much community connectivity. And I really laud the organizations United Way, Nanaimo Beacon, you know, has pulled off from a joke news service, has moved into this very beautiful pairing of people in the community that want to work with others. Across BC now, 211, the phone-in navigation service that has been active because of Central Vancouver Island United Way, has been active in our region as kind of a navigation service. That's now been expanded to the whole province, and almost 3,000 seniors have already phoned in and signed up for support. So what we can do right now, as Greg says, to keep people at home and prevent the spread of the disease, but also to make sure that as a community we remain as strong and connected as we are. And I'm really grateful to the volunteer groups and the leadership in our community that's keeping an eye on that. That's how we're going to get through this together.
I would agree that loss of hope is one of the most frightening things, and we're working hard to keep driving home all of the information that people need to survive and hopefully thrive during this rough time through our Stay Strong daily information thing, which we include positive stories, weird, quirky stories, such as the Barbershop Quartet doing the song to Dr. Bonnie. So I'm going to wrap up now. We're at our 50 minutes limit. There is a question still residing there. Mark Drysdale from the Ladysmith Chamber of Commerce. Greg, I'm going to trust you to type an answer to Mark there. I appreciate that. You respond to him. And pardon me?
I'm going to say,
Yes.
feel free to pass along my contact information to Mark or anyone else who has some follow-up questions as well.
Will do. Do you want to give us your email address right now, sir?
Sure. So it's GP as in Greg Phillips at JFBlaw as in Johnston Franklin Bishop Law.ca. So GP at JFBlaw.ca.
Shirley or Sheila, do you want to remind us of your email address, please?
Sheila.malcolmson.mla@leg.bc.ca. I'll also post on my Facebook page again the link to help small business navigate. There's also a navigation phone and email that's been set up by Small Business BC. Chambers is helping push people to that. I'd love to hear from the business community whether that navigation service is working well for you. I appreciate there being a specialized place, but let me know if it's of good quality and if it meets your needs.
Okay, we'll report back on that for sure. I'm going to wrap this up now and remind those of you who are on the line that next Friday, 11 o'clock again, we will be speaking with Mayor Leonard Krogh and another guest panelist about what's happening at the municipal level, what is local government doing, and what more can local government do to help during this time. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great Easter weekend. Stay home, stay safe, stay healthy, stay strong. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.